I will take you with me. You might learn something.
About soccer?
Nah, mate. Not about soccer. And for fuck's sake, stop saying soccer!
And I tell students, Americans are always moaning about dives. Oh, soccer players dive all the time. First of all, if a defender pushes you in the box and you're about to strike the ball and pushes you in a way that puts you off balance and you're no longer able to execute that shot in the way that you intended, and you don't fall, and the referee, because he's out of shape or, thinking about his post-match meal or whatever, is 30 meters away, and doesn't see it, and you don't fall down, do you think you're going to get the call? No, you're not. But ethically, you have been fouled. The defender has affected the play in an absolutely decisive way, and you deserve the penalty. End of story. So you help the referee along by slightly accentuating, making the truth visible by falling.
That's a dirty question. You can't bring up. I wrote it so long ago. What did I mean? I would argue the same thing. It's like at the most basic level, it's one of the most international cultural practices. It's the most popular cultural practice in the world, and it's one that's been institutionalized in really different ways. So there's this, global governance that really matters. And some other sports have some of this, IAAF and stuff like that, but they're not sports that necessarily also have the same degree of local power in terms of setting rhythms of life, and society. And so it's uniquely popular, it's uniquely transnational, and it's also taken these institutional forms.
Most of the listeners of this podcast live in the US, so do I, and yet I've never had an American guest on here. Time to change that, and change it we did. It's not just one, but 3 American guests today, 2 of whom you just heard a little bit of, and they're actual all real professors. Like, not just visiting assistant professors of football for this hour, no, real professors, who clearly had a lot of fun recording this. The conversation kind of led itself. I'll introduce them in a second. But first, welcome to an unusual publication date for this episode of The Assistant Professor of Football. It's a Thursday night when this drops because I've been in Europe for almost 2 weeks, in England and in Sweden. And when I had time away from my actual work as a historian, I visited some remarkable clubs and games and talked to people. And if you want to see some pictures of that journey, there's already some up on my Twitter account at The Assistant Professor of Football. So we will be back on a regular schedule here already next Monday, the 12th, with the first fruit of that trip. A journey to Clapton Community Football Club, a very special, very political neighborhood club in East London that saved its own ground from the club's previous owners, built its own stands, hosts workshops on how to monitor police violence in the neighborhood, and has very good reasons for why it does not want to play too high up in the league pyramid. Today, however, my guests are 3 scholars who regularly teach in American university classrooms about football or soccer, its culture, its meaning, and its history. And we talked about how that teaching is going, like what would it be like to take a class with them, what do they assign, how did they get into this subject in academia in the first place, what good stuff is being written about the game. And then we went on to opine more broadly about the future of the game globally, as well as here in the US, the next World Cup, why awful people run clubs, especially in the Premier League, and what makes the beautiful game such a unique angle to understand the world. These guests are, first, Brenda Elsey. Brenda is an associate professor of history at Hofstra University in New York, who studies the history of popular culture and politics in 20th century Latin America. She co-edited the important 2017 volume, Football and the Boundaries of History, collection of essays, and is also the author of the book Futbolera, Women and Sport in Latin America. Our next guest is Peter Alegi. He is a professor of history as well at Michigan State University and has authored the book La Duma, Soccer, Politics and Society in South Africa, as well as the influential African Soccerscapes, How a Continent Changed the World's Game. Last but not least is Pablo Sierra. Pablo teaches at the University of Rochester, also in the Department of History, and he specializes in the experiences of Africans and their descendants in colonial Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic during the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, so time of the slave trade. And out of these interests emerged also a class on soccer. This is also the longest episode that I've ever done. It's about an hour and a half, but it flew by when we were talking. It was very entertaining, and I trust you'll have the same experience listening to it as well. So sit back on your couch or a comfortable chair and get something good to drink, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome to not one, but three visiting professors. They are Peter Alegi, Pablo Sierra, and Brenda L.C. As you will know if you've listened to any episodes before, I haven't talked to three people at once at any point in time, and I much look forward to the productive chaos that's going to emerge. But first, we're going to go around and have everybody introduce themselves. I know you are scholars. I know you all have written about soccer, about the game we love, but I'm also curious about your football biographies outside of the classroom, which probably ties into the question of how did you come to write about soccer and teach about soccer in the first place? What's your football biography outside that led you to do whatever you do in scholarship? Brenda, maybe we could start with you.
Sure. I don't have an illustrious biography in soccer outside of academic terms as a child or anything. I grew up in Detroit. Let's see. I was really interested in civil society in Latin America. I specialize in the Southern Cone, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay. I think that's all you need to know why I study football and its implications, especially after Qatar in 2022. But since I delved into that many years ago, I have really dedicated a lot of my life to activism and social justice through football. I am the development lead for the Americas for the FAIR Network and work to observe for racism, gender discrimination, and homophobia in CONCACAF and CONMEBOL. And so I do spend a lot of my life with that.
Right. And the FAIR Network, spelled F-A-R-E, has popped up here before, one of the supporting organizations in bringing the Fantastic Females exhibit to America as well. We've talked to one of the curators on here a few weeks.
True. That's
Germany.
right. We don't just punish. We also work on development grants for grassroots organizations.
Yes, absolutely. And very successfully so. Cool. Any club you support there, where you're at right now, in your place? Or in other places?
I like the San Diego Wave. I like the San Diego Wave. I have a soft spot for Flamengo. I'm okay with Colo-Colo, but mostly, as people will know, it's really hard the more you know about football to just sort of support any one club. So,
is that because there's too many interesting ones, or because you find out that each one of them has their dark spot?
Awful people. No, there's just awful people running clubs everywhere, but there's also good people. So I don't hate any, I don't have any particular club I hate, or anything like that. I don't have any like childhood hangups. It's like, that would be directed at like the Patriots. So in terms of like real, football stuff, I mean, yeah, no. It's just that I think everyone feels this, right? We're going to talk about this, that the deeper you get into it, the harder it is to have a one-dimensional view of a fan base or a team or a club. You know that there's corruption that's just reeking through football, but you also know that there's a lot of people trying their best to sort of save the game from itself.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Pablo. What's your journey that led to the class?
Sure. Well, first, I should say that I completely empathize with everything that Brenda just said. I grew up a Club America fan in Mexico City, and I can't help it. They're the bad guys, right? But it's where I have my memories of Estadio Azteca from since childhood. And yes, it's very difficult to learn that history thoroughly. I think my journey has been more on the teaching side, right? I haven't had the opportunity to yet research on football, but I teach Peter's book and I teach Brenda's book. So this is a real treat. My journey started around 2013 when the chair of my department said, hey, let's come up with some new innovative coursework, things that maybe you've always dreamed of teaching, but have never dared to. And 2013, there was immense social movements in Brazil. The following year, we would have the World Cup. And so it made perfect sense to say, you know what? We're going to read a little Eduardo Galeano, and we're going to pitch a class. Which, by the way, I should say, I'm a colonialist, right? Anything after 1700 is deeply terrifying to me. I understand that things happened, but not in ways that I understand. So this was also a way to broaden my interests and my teaching fields into the 20th and 21st century. So yeah, that's how the soccer course began. It began as a course on the history of Latin America, and after student feedback and demand, now it's a world history through soccer course. So that's been the journey so far.
We should clarify maybe when you say you are you're a colonialist, you're chiefly working on 16th, 17th, 18th century originally, and then soccer has kind of fast forwarded you a little bit.
Right, and I should clarify, colonialist for Latin America. I mostly study African descended populations in Mexico and in the Caribbean. So a different kind of colonialism than that we might study in on the African continent. So yes, very, very far afield from what I'm writing on these days.
Wonderful. Thank you. Peter.
I'm glad to hear that there's a Club America supporter on this podcast, because I know that when I declare my loyalty, allegiance, fealty to Juventus, I get funny looks. What's a left-wing academic doing supporting the evil empire? But that requires a separate podcast. I would like to point out, however, that Juventus did the impossible in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War, when it brought together Gianni Agnelli, of course, the chairman of Fiat and owner of Juventus since the fascist period, with Palmiro Togliatti, the famously famous Communist Party leader in Italy, at the stadium, because Togliatti was a Juventus fan. And so they sat next to each other in the Tribuna d'Onore, in the VIP section of the Stadio Comunale, which was also built by Mussolini in the 1930s. So, that's something worth pointing out. In fact, there's a good chunk of the Southern proletariat that Gramsci was so endeared by and fought for his entire adult life that still today supports Juventus. In fact, a frequent insult that's made by opposing fans, like the famously right-wing bourgeois fans of Inter. And I know you had a recent podcast with somebody, and that's again, problematic in a whole other way. But their insult to Juve is that we're not supported in Turin. We're supported by the southern peasants. So lots of interesting things there. But why am I a Juventus fan? Well, I was born and grew up in Rome, Italy, and my family had moved to Rome just the year that I was born. My mom is from Rome, but my dad was working in Milan. So my two oldest brothers, they're an Inter fan and a Milan fan. So they were texting me furiously yesterday related to the Champions League semifinal derby that was being played. And I said, don't tell me the score. I'm at a doctor's appointment. I'm going to watch it later. And so who could compete with Milan and Inter in the family? Certainly not the Rome teams at that time. And so when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I picked Juventus, flipping through my Panini album. I liked the jerseys, and I could see they had a pedigree. And sort of to one up my older brothers, I picked Juventus. And my parents brought me to my first Juve game in May of 1976. Living in Rome, I usually watched Juventus away, so usually in disguise also, and scarf tucked into my jersey and so on. and the game was Perugia-Juventus, last game of the season, and Juve was 1 point behind Torino, our city rivals, who were having a fabulous run in the 70s. And back then, victory was only 2 points, right? Not 3. And so Torino was playing at home and needed to draw or lose, and we needed to win against Perugia to at the very least get to a playoff match or perhaps vault over them. Well, the impossible happened, in little Perugia, with its proud communist heritage, defeated Juventus 1-0. And Torino won the title. So my christening, so to speak, of watching Juventus was actually a pretty brutal one. It was not what many people assume, which is, you jump on the bandwagon. No, I actually began with a crippling loss that scarred me for life. And so that trauma has shaped my deep and abiding love for Juventus. I never take a victory for granted, and we can talk about that some other time. But what I'm saying is that I was born with the football virus. So that's my football biography. I've played football. I've coached football, at a fairly decent level. And as an academic, I've been teaching football courses since 1996. So I'm an old man.
Most of your scholarship and your teaching is not on Juventus. It is on football in Africa. How did that come about? How did you orient yourself there?
No, just a qualification. Most of my teaching is not about football in Africa. I wish it were. Unfortunately, I have to also be a serious historian. And
most of your football-related teaching is not on. Yeah,
right. But I spend most of my intellectual life working on Southern Africa and South Africa in particular, the history of 19th and 20th century South Africa. So how did it come about? Is that what your question was?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Philip? Well, I mean, my interest in South Africa was a political one that came in the 1980s when the fight against apartheid was probably the most important international issue alongside Nicaragua and the Contras. And so, for me growing up in Italy, I mean, my family was the kind of family that disagreed about a lot of things and shouted at each other at the table. We had numerous newspapers and kind of middle-class intellectual family. And, apartheid was something everybody could agree on. It was something that had to go. It was arguably the greatest moral crime of the post World War II era. It was something that even a puny teenage mind like mine could grasp. And so, when I moved to the States in the mid 80s, I've just found myself in the midst of a huge divestment campaign on the campus where my mom was finishing her degree in New Haven, Connecticut. And so I started, shouting slogans and putting anti-apartheid stickers on my car and supporting the movement as best I could as again, somebody who had never been to South Africa and didn't really understand anything beyond, the righteousness of the cause to bring freedom and democracy to the country. So I just went to college and educated myself and then had an opportunity to go and coach in South Africa. And that's how it began.
Brenda, your most recent book would be Futbolera, Women and Sport in Latin America. You're also the co-author of an edited volume. That's a very important collection of essays, Football and the Boundaries of History, Critical Studies in Soccer. When you started at Hofstra University, which is where you're at now, and proposed writing about soccer, what was the reaction from other academics? Is it still an exotic thing to come in with to a job interview and say, here's my project, here's who I am, here's how this sheds light on our field? Or did you find open doors immediately?
No, it's really annoying. I continue to be highly annoyed. I'm at a low level of annoyance all the time. if you need butts and seats, anybody can teach it, and the views of the administration. And it's unfortunate because of the history of academia in the liberal arts and sciences. Anyway, this is different in a school of comm or something like that. If you have journalism students or whatnot. And it's different in Latin America, where there's like a really strong tradition of intellectuals that write, for example, in Brazil, write about football, anthropology, journalism. That's a very rich tradition. But in US academia, I mean, could you imagine if I walked into a hallway and said to one of my colleagues, thank goodness you study literature, because I just hate it. That is ugh, right? Or if I was like, dance is so boring and stupid to me. I mean, that is nothing that you would say, right? But people say it all the time about sports. And yet at the same time, there's another reaction, which is I'm a fan and I like it and it fills classes. So I'm just going to teach it willy-nilly however I want. And I'm just like never going to include women. And I'm just going to think that whatever I like reading is, we all teach classes on things we don't specialize in necessarily or write in, but there's an approach to it, And so I do feel as though when I co-edited a volume of the Radical History Review with Peter, actually, and we had a forum on teaching, and we recognized it then many years ago and tried to say, look, there's this whole body of research and writing out there by these teachers, people like Adrian Burgos that work on sport more broadly, not just football, right? And so that's been my experience. It's a struggle. I don't want to like complain too much because there's people that, have it far worse, in terms of getting legitimacy for their field. But I have felt that it's been very difficult to break silos in terms of and to enter sport and the way in which sport and football in particular in Latin America can actually contribute to the dominant historical narratives and understanding, rather than be like this subfield that people just read about when that's the one book that students won't hate or something like that. And instead, I want to kind of constantly put it in dialogue with dominant narratives, right? You want to learn about colonialism in Africa in a continental way. And I'm going to put Peter's book. We're learning about both those things. I have them when I teach that book, when I teach Peter's book, Soccerscapes, I have them take a map and start to take a map of Africa and put all the clubs on the map. You know what I mean? It's about learning a kind of broader narrative. And it's almost like the soccer's cool and everything, but it's just a lens like other things when you're teaching things that are very unfamiliar to students. So I love it and I hate it. And I operate in this space of just kind of like, I feel a bit alternately joyful and grouchy about it.
Right. And as you mentioned briefly, Peter has been modest and not mentioned his own book. The title is African Soccerscapes, How a Continent Changed the World's Game. And it's now about 12 or 13 years old, I think. Is that right, Peter?
That sounds about right. It's so old that you can get it for free now.
That's good.
Well, more people might read it. These textbooks are often famously expensive. But you're right, Brenda. It's my experience too. Even growing up, so much of what I know about the world's geography, political dynamics, my first encounters with the structures that class and race and gender create without having names and tags to put on this really comes through being exposed to soccer, and you can play with this in the classroom very much as well. Well, you already said when it comes to professors, some people might be tempted to say, I'm a fan, I'm going to teach this class willy-nilly, and I'll focus on the kind of stars that I like. Is that the approach that students come with into your classes? In other words, who takes your classes? Who are these people? These students, what's the kind of population that draws? Pablo mentioned Dean came to him and said, let's think about innovative classes that excite students. So is that wow factor? What kind of student population does that draw into your classes?
I think it really varies. I mean, the first thing I tell the students day one is if you're here to learn trivia on Maradona or Pelé, you are going to be very deeply disappointed for the next 16 weeks. right? Like I'm not here to help you with your factoids. I'm just not. I would say it really varies how you pitch a course, right? I think in the first iterations of my course, I was really interested in building a curriculum on Latin American history. So I leaned heavily into that, right? And that means, for instance, in my case, many Mexican students simply don't know the history of Brazil, Argentina, Colombia. They're just woefully ignorant of it because they've never received it at home or in middle school or high school. So for them, it's an education on, like America, the continent, right? And that geography that Brenda was describing is absolutely correct, right? When you start to think of, oh, wow, Club Pachuca was founded well after all these other clubs from Buenos Aires, right? It starts to really open up their mind frame. I think in more recent iterations of the course, it's a more well-versed American student base, right? These kids who they're walking around with Chelsea jerseys and Arsenal scarves, and they're actually quite invested in European football. So the challenge there is like, okay, so yes, it's absolutely central to European societies and cultures. What do those cultures look like in Latin America, in Nigeria, for instance? I'm thinking of Peter's book in that particular, those sections on Lagos and Azikiwe. So for them, it's also kind of saying, all right, let me break out of my little Champions League specialty headset and start to think about what football looks like in Buenos Aires, right? What does it look like in Santiago de Chile? So it's a really interesting mix in these courses. I would say that if before it tended to be like students of Hispanic descent, now it's much broader. And that may be an effect of where I teach. That's the University of Rochester. But it's a really cosmopolitan group of students, and increasingly of women who want to make sense of how do we know so much about the U.S. women's national soccer team, but why can't we put that in conversation with other countries? And of course, that's where Brenda and Joshua Nadel's book, Futbolera, has been really, really influential, at least for me in my teaching.
That's especially good to hear. I was going to ask about the gender ratio as well, not just the Chelsea shirt to Arsenal shirt ratio, but gender ratio that you overwhelmingly get male students or not. Seems like that's changing. Is that your experience too,
well,
Brenda?
The gender ratio is an interesting issue. And the reason I raised that is that the folks who come in usually with the most enthusiasm, and sometimes those who believe they have the greatest knowledge, tend to be men. And so it tends to be skewed about 2-1 towards men. But looking back, I think it has changed. I think it used to be more like 3-1. So I think the ratio is improving. And as usual, as is often true in my other courses, the women students tend to do more work and are more assiduous and perform better than most of the men. So it kind of plays out in interesting ways. But the students, I share what Pablo, my experience is very similar to what Pablo just described. The classes tend to be fairly cosmopolitan. I do have a fair amount of international students in my classes. I just submitted my final grades a couple of days ago. I had students from multiple African countries, from Central America, South America. I had an Italian student, and on and on. I mean, it was really quite exciting. And for sure, compared to 1996, when I taught my first soccer history class, the year that MLS started, which is probably why they allowed me to do it.
That's the best thing I've ever heard about the MLS existing. I'm really excited about that tidbit.
It was called Soccer and Imperialism. Is that certainly the U.S. student is far more knowledgeable, male or female, working class or middle class, and far more knowledgeable and familiar with everything about the world of soccer. Everything from promotion, relegation to what the big clubs are to the big names. I mean, I used to have to explain the basics. It was really quite frustrating, actually, for many years. And I don't have to do that anymore. I mean, people don't have to have Real Madrid explained to them. People don't have to, in most cases, have to be explained how you end up from being a first division club to going into bankruptcy, perhaps, or going into the third tier. So that's really empowering and a sign that soccer culture has matured in this country. At the same time, what's really unusual is that Americans don't know their own history, in the sense that they tend to believe that soccer started probably in the 70s with the arrival of Pelé and Title IX. From many women bring that up, and they're astonished to find out that there were soccer games played in the 1890s among women in California, and that there were working class teams in the early 20th century. Similarly, they're astonished to find out that the precursor of the United States Soccer Federation, which was called the American Football Association, was, I think, the second one in the world that was founded outside of Britain. And it just blows their mind. And then once you start breaking down these initial barriers, they start to pay attention in a different way. And I also put that on the syllabus. In the second line of my syllabus, it says, this course goes beyond highlights, barstool talk, and FIFA video games to explore the big questions in the global history of soccer, aka football, such as. Right. So they know right away, if you're looking for that cocktail party knowledge, as Pablo was saying, and as Brenda knows very well, that's how many of our students come in. This is probably not the right place unless you have really interesting cocktail parties, in which case, okay, then it's the right place for you.
Similar experience for you, Pablo and Brenda? Are there narratives that you have to push back against as well in the classroom? Are those similar?
Yeah, I mean, there's a general hostility to history in this country right now. And there's a couple just key, barriers that I think or narratives that you have to challenge that are not, specific to soccer or football history or sports history. So I guess I've been focusing on those things, like ideas of what is revisionism. If I teach a course on race and sport in the Americas and I teach Jackie Robinson, right, or something like that, is that a kind of revisionism? Would you use surgical tools from the 19th century today to do an operation? You wouldn't, right? You get better and better at what you do. And so the narratives that I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to grapple with them is that this inclusion of whether it be, trans history in sport, which goes back to as old as sport is, or whether it's race and gender or including other countries or thinking about immigrants or not calling Cubans defectors or whatever you want to say, it's about us getting better and better at our jobs and not about a charity act with which I include marginalized populations. And so I would say that's like my number one narrative that I'm combating all the time in everything I do and everything I teach. And football and sport can be a little less jarring for them. They're very tired of the political rhetoric in this country that as it reflects on history. So it's a way to get them to think about nuance and being intellectuals and what do you use history for that's a little less hackneyed for them and ones that they're just tired. It's a little fresher to have those debates. So I guess that's been my thing this year. That's been my main sort of motivation in teaching, is that history is not a bad thing to study. It doesn't have to be a bad thing to debate, that it is a really important pillar of democracy to debate historical points. But instead of setting up just two positions or one kind of thing, we can really think about what it means to understand social justice or understand economic inequality. What does that really look like? And we can do it in this way that's not so, I guess, played out for them in their heads. They can come with a fresh idea about things versus if I taught something like immigration, bad or good. It was just repeating the same ridiculousness, right? And instead it's like, let's take a very careful look at, let's say, the Cubans that played in the Negro Leagues in the 1940s. What do we learn about race and how does that continue today? So that's the type of stuff I'm up to.
Yeah, I would say that students are absolutely saturated with the political discourse and those polarizing kind of dynamics that we have going on. What I found really useful this past fall when I taught this course was to think of yes, history is valid. You can do poli-sci, you can do computer science, and you're still going to need history, right? So how do you incentivize a student that's maybe skeptical of it, just on a ground level? And this last semester, we worked on the history of childhood. How formative, right? You're playing in the street is when you're 7, 8, 9. And mind you, these kids are mostly 18, 19, 20 when they're in my classroom. But they already have really strong ideas about this is what play should look like. This is who we should include and exclude. And so one of the exercises that we did was, okay, let's think about that historically, right? Where do we get these ideas about who can be an athlete and who can't be? Who can represent the nation or whatnot? And to tie together some of the things we've been hearing, things as simple as the Panini albums, right? The Panini albums are like this global phenomenon. In the US, you really have to find immigrant enclaves for those to make sense. But once you explain how crucial that material culture is to childhood, at least in Latin America, it's absolutely foundational. So one of these exercises that we did was to have the students say, what is your first memory of football, right? And they were beautiful. Some were very short, like, I don't remember. I think my cousin beat me up after it or something, right? And others were like, no, I remember being really good on my soccer team up until I was 8. And then my dad says I shouldn't play anymore because I'm a girl, right? So some of it was like formative, a little ethnographic almost. So I think there's ways that we can teach these more universal values and meanings that football really has a particular way of giving us a window into that, right? Another thing that I brought up, and here I expose myself entirely, I grew up with the Mexican version of Captain Tsubasa. I don't know if you all know that Japanese cartoon from the early 80s. In Mexico, it was exported and dubbed into Mexican Spanish in the early 90s, and my entire generation was just obsessed with it.
Wait a second, is this soccer related? I've never heard of this.
Yeah. Captain Tsubasa is a Japanese cartoon from the 1980s, and it has some really, really problematic representations of who can play football. And it's also really about me and my group of friends, the 6 of us, trying to make the team, and we're playing that private team from the other side of town, and it's very gendered and it's very classed, and it's universal, right? This is something that children in Afghanistan watched, and in Italy, and in Mexico, and in Brazil, and everyone has a different relationship to it, and it's a way of studying childhood, right? And I think that's where history has this capaciousness to say that's also history. Now, what do you think of it as a 19-year-old? So yeah, I just think there's a lot we can do with this particular lens.
I just looked this up, by the way, while you were talking. Fascinating. I was not allowed to watch almost any cartoons growing up. So I'm not literate in that area.
There's like 20 seasons of Captain Tsubasa. Don't worry, you can catch up.
It's not too late, huh? Okay. Yeah. Might be a summer project. You've already answered this question in some way, but the foreword of the book that Brenda co-edited in 2017, the Football and the Boundaries of History, makes this claim, and it's rare but always appreciated when a book comes right out and says, I argue that, we argue that, and this book does, and it says that we argue that, quote, the study of football's history provides a unique opportunity to understand the human condition. All of you have said something about what kind of opportunity to understand the human condition it provides. The book claims, however, it provides a unique one. So what Brenda is laughing as I speak. What is unique about football's lens on the world? And what does it teach us that other historical, cultural studies angles in the classroom can't quite teach us in the same way? And that can be specifically from studying it from a North American perspective. That can be studying it with a global point in view. Brenda, what did you mean when you wrote this?
That's a dirty question. You can't bring up. I wrote it so long ago. What did I mean? I mean, I would argue the same thing. It's like at the most basic level, it's one of the most international cultural practices. It's the most popular cultural practice in the world, and it's one that's been institutionalized in really different ways. So there's this, global governance that really matters. And some other sports have some of this, IAAF and stuff like that, but they're not sports that necessarily also have the same degree of local power in terms of setting rhythms of life, and society. And so it's uniquely popular, it's uniquely transnational, and it's also taken these institutional forms that I think are incredibly important. Like when I explain to students the concept of, the member-owned clubs like Flamengo or something, like it's just like mind blown. They can't imagine. And so, I think that's part of what makes it unique. Yeah, I guess I would say just that is the most basic level. It is a kind of language and insight into how this thing that is putatively exactly the same game wherever you go, men, women, mixed clubs, is so different politically at different moments and in different places.
No, I think that's a very good answer to a dirty question. I'm sorry, but thanks for taking.
No, I didn't mean it that way.
As well. Yeah.
I just don't remember anything. I go and talk about, citizens and sportsmen, which I wrote in like 2009 or something on Chile. And I'll have a Chilean graduate student be like on page 89. And I'll be like, I can't even believe I wrote that. Like, wow, like good on me then.
Yeah.
But I didn't mean it that way. It's just,
no.
I don't have memory for it.
I get it. At similar moments. Yeah.
If I could just jump in here, just to support and build on what Brenda just said, the only things that come close to football in its universal popularity and cross-cutting appeal, I think, are music, and some might argue religion. So, when I travel, if I don't have my soccer ball with me deflated in my bag, I usually have my shoes, because I know I can go and pick up a game and meet people, and hopefully break bread with people and learn some languages when I travel. You could bring your instrument with you. You can bring a portable drum, or you can bring maybe your guitar, and you will have probably similar type experience. You've never been to a place, you don't speak the language, but yet you are going to be able to interact with people and possibly open doors and learn a lot and have that give and take that really is one of the most beautiful things in life. Religion comes close in the sense that the ritualized portion of football, I think, is extremely close to religion, at least the religion that I grew up with, the religion of, saints, the religion of transubstantiation, and why is it not cannibalism, Dad? That kind of thing. It's close, but religion is different, because religion is much more exclusive at specific times than football ever is. I mean, the gender dimension is the most obvious one, but we could expand on that, right? I mean, women are excluded from, at least in the case of Catholic Christianity, certainly most institutional roles and much else. But a lot of religions have segregation within the temple or the mosque or, the sacred space, something that in football only happens in very, very few places and is heavily contested there in ways that religion never is. And despite what people think, thanks to the great Richard Kapuscinski, soccer generally does not start wars. If anything, soccer has a misplaced reputation for stopping them. Like in the case of Nigeria during the so-called Biafran War, where, people think that Pele's arrival with Santos stopped the war, which is absolutely not true. Because Santos played in Lagos, which was far away from where the war was taking place. But anyway, so I just wanted to toss those two thoughts in.
Football may not start wars, but it may explain some of them. So let me push back on you a little bit and see what the others think as well. Isn't football, as it works in different places across the globe, also always an exercise in clarifying boundaries? You versus your brothers, South versus North, right-wing bourgeoisie Inter versus Milan. And is not precisely that aspect of football, that you might say exclusive aspect of football, something that Americans with their global mindedness, right? We can parachute into any place in the world and study it. Something that Americans need to learn about specifically. And isn't football also a good way for them to understand tribalism in a way that American society can't understand it?
Oh, sure. You can use it as a lens, as we all have been arguing, I think, in these first few minutes of the conversation. But historically, what are the examples of actual wars being started by football? We can think of many started by religion. Now, there are political forces driving the religious expression of many wars, particularly in the sort of, pre-20th century era. And there are economic ones, of course. But I struggle to find one that, aside from maybe the El Salvador, Honduras case that Kapuscinski wrote about, which is again problematic for a different reason, that you can point to. But maybe I'm forgetting one or two famous cases. But that, I think what you said, Philip, is really important, that the football is a way to look at empowerment and disempowerment, inclusion and exclusion. That's another very useful way of putting forward, soccer as a way to study society, and as well as, past and present. The thing about soccer or football, and I use those terms interchangeably, and my students are also shocked to know that soccer is a British word. And I use the English a lot as my straw man in my courses, and US students love that. So I encourage other instructors in North America to do it. And if you go to England, do it and see what the reaction of the locals is. It's so much fun. It's really riveting, and say a lot of good things about the Scots too. The English dislike that a great deal. So I lost my chain of thought as soon as I brought up the straw man.
That Maradona goal was a goal. No hand there. Just see what happens.
Well, what are the boundaries of ethics of a dive? Like, I bring up Dennis Bergkamp, for example, and I tell students, Americans are always moaning about dives. Oh, soccer players dive all the time.
In your repertoire.
First of all, if a defender pushes you in the box and you're about to strike the ball and pushes you in a way that puts you off balance and you're no longer able to execute that shot in the way that you intended, and you don't fall, and the referee, because he's out of shape or, thinking about his post-match meal or whatever, is 30 meters away, and doesn't see it, and you don't fall down, do you think you're going to get the call? No, you're not. But ethically, you have been fouled. The defender has affected the play in an absolutely decisive way, and you deserve the penalty. End of story. So you help the referee along by slightly accentuating, making the truth visible by falling. There is nothing ethically wrong with that. That is a perfectly legitimate position. Standing up and showing how manly you are, or how womanly you are, or, how playerly you are, actually doesn't get you anything. You haven't demonstrated anything to anyone except actually validated the fouling player.
I agree. I agree.
That's Dennis Bergkamp, right? I mean, that's a Calvinist point of view, believe it or not.
So I was just going to say, I was thinking about, the question of religion, and at least whenever I went to my grandmother's house, there was one rule. It's like, you don't talk about religion, you don't talk about politics, and you don't talk about football. So of course we did, right? It's the only three things we ever spoke about. And so this idea of identifying or not identifying, I think is really powerful, especially when we're teaching in the US. It's so important to say, this student from the National University in Mexico City is a Pumas fan. And he is not going to break bread with a Club America fan unless there's a World Cup going, right? And so kind of like that kind of complexity where students start to realize like, oh, Mexicans more than immigrants. Oh, this is fast. Oh, there's middle class Mexican, right? So that kind of like, if you want to call it Jersey tribalism, I think is really healthy. I think it's really healthy to teach. And what's maybe most interesting is when it travels, right? So in 2005, I was able to spend some time in Dakar, in Senegal, and I would walk around the market with my jerseys, and people would stop me and they'd say, Blanco, Cuauhtemoc Blanco. And I'd be like, yes, he was on the national team. And they're like, do you want a discount on this knockoff jersey that I'm selling? Yes, I do. Thank you very much. And so that universality that Brenda and Peter were explaining, it's actually true. Like it's tangible, right? And I think that's maybe what separates this particular sport from all others, in that there's a global language to it and the global material culture that goes along with it. It's quite powerful. And I've never traveled with a deflated soccer ball like Peter does, but maybe this is something I should pick up, because it's absolutely where the conversations happen, where perhaps someone would say, I don't know what I have in common with you. And I'd say, well, apparently we were watching that Cuauhtemoc Blanco match back in 2002. It works.
Yeah. I trust Peter also travels with a pump.
It causes problems at TSA.
All right.
Almost as much as my table soccer figures.
But the kind of rivalries that Pablo referred to is part of what it was pushing at, right? There's a certain kind of naivete sometimes in the global engagement that North Americans and Europeans do in some ways, but especially North Americans have the privilege to exercise, that you kind of pick teams almost as a souvenir, and you assume that there is something universal, and you go to English stadiums and you can see American tourists wearing the jerseys of the away team in the home section, not understanding the sacrilege of what is I've witnessed it, not understanding the sacrilege of what was going on. So part of, I think, what studying soccer, football can help Americans understand too is in part how intensely tribal the world works in ways that aren't entirely predictable from a North American context too. And then sometimes how uniting it is too. Go ahead.
Yes, sometimes students push back on that and say, that college sports, at least at a university like mine, I mean, we're basically, a professional franchise with an educational side gig. They see that rivalry, that tribalism, in a pretty concrete and legible way. I mean, for example, in our case at Michigan State, the rivalry is with the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, which is only about an hour away. And it is a very intense rivalry. It's lived differently from how a rivalry in European football or South American football is lived. but it is real, and there is animosity, and at times it spills over into physical conflict. You may remember the incident that happened in the tunnel at the University of Michigan Stadium at the Big House, what was it, last season, where several players were arrested in a brawl that happened, so, and there are sometimes, unfortunately, confrontations between fans of opposing universities. I mean, that, they're also imbibing copious amounts of alcohol, just like some football fans do. And that tends to light the match, in this kindling that's always ready to ignite. So there are elements of American sports that I think do allow you to tap into and say, okay, it's sort of similar to that. Would you show up, in Ann Arbor with, your MSU gear for everyone to see? Okay, maybe some will, and they won't fear for their lives as you do in other contexts around the world, but you do stick out like a sore thumb. And people from the University of Michigan, when they come here, I don't see a lot of them openly wearing their gear the way they do at home. And I think that's something that, as instructors, we can also tap into. There are these rivalries, much more so actually in college sports than in professional sports, with the partial exception maybe of a Red Sox-Yankees rivalry, where I remember going to Fenway Park. I'm a Red Sox fan. I did my PhD a couple of blocks from the Green Monster. And I went to Fenway Park with my father, who was a diehard Yankee fan, Italian-American, grew up with Joe DiMaggio, all of that stuff. And he was so brazen, he went to Fenway Park to watch a Red Sox-Yankees game with me with a Yankees cap. And we went to get a beer, and the person at the stand carded him. My dad, at the time was probably in his 60s. And she carded him, and he didn't have his ID with him because he was just, I don't know where it was. And she refused to give him a beer. I had to buy him the beer because, it was just like, how dare you show up here with a Yankees hat? Well,
the carding too is a particularly American practice as well.
Well, they have fan cards. They have fan IDs in Europe.
Yes, the Tessera in Italy, for example. Yeah. Well, you've already, all of you, harped on a little bit the growth of interest in the game. Where do you see this headed in America as well? I mean, your student population has changed. Peter has said it's also become more soccer literate. The mid 2000s have seen these popular books, right? Goldblood 4, How Soccer Explains the World. The kind of the discourse entered a little bit middle class readership. How do you see interest in the game developing in America, in the US? What kind of interest is it? What demographics is it drawing? And what is the future of Americans' interest in the global game? Not in the MLS specifically, but in what we are interested in here. Maybe Brenda?
Well, I mean, there's 2026, and we'll see how that is received. One of the things that a lot of people are working on is trying to change the way that people in the U.S. Perceive the game, and to try to use 2026 to build especially urban youth sports instead of just focusing on a top-down view of what the World Cup brings. It should bring a lot of FIFA investment. Of course, the head of the FIFA Charitable Foundation is former Argentine arch-conservative president Mauricio Macri. So there's not much hope in terms of that unless there's a lot of pressure. And so there's been, a lot of different things going on with the city bids. You should try to pay attention. Miami, for example, is going to be a really interesting place, and pressuring clubs like Inter Miami to use this opportunity to really encourage and change the local structures of the game so that they're accessible to urban working class youth, which they haven't been. So I'm hoping that's it. What we've seen in the past is, it'll be a real, like, go sit in the luxury boxes here and there, and the immigrant population, which has been essential in keeping this going, will be largely ignored and shut out as much as possible. Also look for debates around homophobia, and the Mexican and Mexican American teams, in particular. That'll be really interesting, coming towards 2026. I think, it'll be a real ride, but I hope people start to pay attention early, those of us who teach it, those of us who care about it, because there'll be a number of projects, and the more that we can mobilize people who care about not just replicating the Premier League, which is gross, would be good. I'm sorry, Premier League people, but your league is just the worst. Okay, let me just say, Henry Kissinger is on the committee for 2026. What even does that mean? So, I mean, is there any hope? It's hard to stay hopeful when you see things like that it's going to look any differently than anywhere else. But I hope it does. And I hope a lot of, people from different sectors, youth coaches, really get involved, and support the efforts to make this, to show that in the US, it doesn't have to be just this hyper consumerist kind of experience. I hope.
And you think having a World Cup is an opportunity to show that?
If we can make it happen, then we can show it. But if it's just going to be totally captured by the likes of Robert Kraft and Henry Kissinger. Robert Kraft is also on the committee, which was appointed by former President Donald Trump. So you shouldn't be really super surprised. We want to change that. I think a lot of people do, whether it just be, hey, we're going to apply for a local grant from the city of Miami to do a youth program and to, maybe get some activities around the cup for them to access these amazing facilities, things like that, That's what we're hoping. Right.
Yeah, no, what you mean. But trivia, Henry Kissinger is a big fan of SPVGG Fürth, second league German team.
Yeah, he can't go.
That does not qualify him, I think. Was that?
I guess he can't go and see them lest he be arrested for crimes against humanity.
Yes.
I think he's unfortunately not allowed there.
Right, that's part.
So I guess
part of the story
to stream
too.
it.
Yeah.
I just can't believe it's so hard for me just not to mention that, but thank you. I appreciate your podcast time to get to remind people of that committee.
Oh my. No, I mean, I did one World Cup episode on the recent one, and I was sorely tempted to nod, and I think it turned out to be an appropriate angle, but I am looking at 2026 with a mixture of dread and some joy in there somewhere, I guess, but I'll still have to take my pulse on that. Pablo?
No, I was going to touch on something that Brenda mentioned with the Mexican American community and this, like, the homophobia, and when the Tri goes on tour and you hear this chant in the stadiums, it's really coming to a head in interesting ways. Of all portals, ESPN had a story on Club Mushe, which is like this queer club that's rising through like the 4th division, 3rd division, and they're trying to, ascend through promotion. So there's a really interesting discourse on queerness in sport that tracks across the hemisphere, and I think globally probably. And that is going to become much more prominent, I think, in the next 5-6 years. There's a professional women's soccer league in Mexico now. I mean, they failed to make the World Cup, but there's this greater visibility of it. And a lot of the players there are queer. And I think it's phenomenal, fantastic. And it's going to lead a lot of people who maybe aren't interested in sport, but are interested in LGBTQ issues, to come in and like interrogate what's happening with these teams. And, Megan Rapinoe is, of course, extremely influential in anything she posts or advocates for. And there's a transnational following to that. So I think we're going to start to see a lot more intersectionality there with the question of LGBT issues and sport, especially through these mega events for the next 5-6 years.
I can't help but think back to 1994, which was a really exciting time. Nothing like being 24 and the World Cup coming to the US. After moving from Italy, it felt like I was in the Kalahari of soccer. And now 2026, 3 decades later, what is it going to be like? I think, first of all, we had a 24-team tournament in 1994, first one with 3 African teams. And now we're going to have a 48-team tournament. So, just the scope of this event is extraordinary. I remember about 94, how the closer you got to the venue, the more the vibe got sort of carnivalesque. And in some cities, this was more integrated into the urban fabric, and in others, less so. I'm curious to see how that's going to play out this time around, because I have the feeling that in 2026, the World Cup is going to be more visible. It's going to take over more of the mediascape and speak to the powers that be more loudly, and more people are going to engage with this. In 94, when you were a couple of miles from the venues, sometimes you didn't even know the World Cup was happening. Now, when you got to the venue, there were 60,000 people there, et cetera, and it was fabulous and very peaceful and well organized, as American sporting events tend to be. But in 2026, it'll be very, very interesting to follow that. Plus, in 94, there were no fan parks or official viewing areas. So if you wanted to watch a game, you usually go to a pub or a restaurant, usually, as they call them in the States, an ethnic one, which is not an expression I like, but I'm just using it because I can't think of a better one right now. And so you'd go there and you have like-minded, sick people like us, who obsess about football. And it was wonderful. But now in 2026, we're going to have large venues with corporate advertising and tickets and all of this stuff. And I think most Americans, or people who happen to be in the United States, will be experiencing the World Cup there rather than at the venues, because there's only so many seats and the prices are going to be exorbitant. We know that. And how's that going to play out? That's going to be quite interesting. Formal and informal viewing areas. I think, sociologists should really start getting their grant proposals together if they haven't already. And I would say historians too, I'd like to maybe do an oral history, because I wish we had done it in 94. I think we lost a huge opportunity. I was too young to think that this was something that should be done. But an oral history of 2026 as it's happening, a kind of StoryCorps of soccer in a way. Even if it's only 5 minutes, like sit down and talk, a grandparent and child going to the game together. I mean, that is the quintessential sporting relationship, right? Or, a conversation between fans of opposing nations. And the World Cup is one of those events where people come together and don't generally fight unless they're English, or maybe Serbian. It's very rare that at a World Cup, people have traveled, spent so much money. They often have family members with them, that they're there to beat heads. It's quite different from a club football scenario. And plus, getting into the US is going to be really complicated for a lot of people. Talk about inclusion and exclusion. I'm curious to see, especially if a certain party wins the presidential election. It's going to be tough for a lot of people to get into the States, but maybe that's a different conversation for another time. So it's going to be fascinating. And can people's attention be captured over the course of what seems to be a month and a half, close to 2 months? Because that's a much longer time frame than what the World Cup usually dishes up. I have some questions about that. I'm curious to see how it's going to play out. But at the grassroots, I have zero hopes that anything will change. In fact, I think it's more likely it'll get worse. In other words, that, from what I've seen in many other countries in the past couple of decades, the arrival of the World Cup takes away resources from the grassroots.
Yes, it does.
In the United States, we have the advantage of being so rich for a lot of things. Sporting infrastructure is one of those. I mean, we don't have to build the 90,000 seat stadiums. We have them already. And so there's going to be less public expenditure, as far as I understand it, outside of the security stuff, than in several of the previous World Cups. But nevertheless, I think the space is going to be even more crowded with kind of market logics and this very warped understanding of what soccer can and should be in this country.
Peter, I was going to say, since you mentioned proposals and like sociology projects, historical projects, I think you and Brenda should really get together and write this football, soccer primary source reader that we all need that doesn't exist for our classes. And you can have a whole section on planning a World Cup and its failures, right? And you can look at like Colombia 1986. Oh no, it didn't happen. And we know why. And Brenda, you could contribute the Chilean case studies. But I mean, among the things that will happen, right, is that there will be this avalanche of scholarship that we always see in these 4-year cycles. And so we know that at least in the American mindset, the amount of attention that will be devoted to this, and in Canada and in Mexico too, is just going to be enormous. And you're right, I don't think we're prepared for how massive it's going to be, but we could be a little bit more prepared if we had that source reader that maybe 2 or 3 people on this panel could put together. Just saying, I'll put it out there.
Yeah. Well, since you're talking shop already, Pablo, my cycle doesn't run in a 4-year rhythm, but that of many Americans do. And even if Peter and Brenda are going to be busy putting that reader out until then, their classes will also be filled to the rafters probably and waitlisted as the World Cup draws closer. A very practical question from professor to professor. How do you assess people in these classes? I mean, you don't give them a soccer quiz, but what forms of assessment do you, for listeners who are not in college anymore, what kind of stuff would they write or would be quizzed on in your soccer classes?
I mean, they have to write essays, they have to do research, kind of standard historical assignments, something about, for example, the treatment of Afro-Brazilians in football compared with, African Americans in the United States. How much does historical context come to play? Does it deviate from other, ways or spheres in history where Black populations had to circulate, right? Like, is football or sports any different, let's say, than the medical field? Because they have standard history texts as well. So, something like that. Sometimes I try to get them to write very short pieces, kind of like a DBQ, but where they're actually watching a clip or an interview or something like that, because they have a very difficult time building the skill of writing about something they're seeing or listening to. That's like something we really try to develop just at the basic level. So sometimes I'm like, take a look at, this particular I use like Rumble in the Jungle to talk about like decolonization, right? So When We Were Kings, like that movie, if I take a bit from that movie and I say, explain to me what's happening in this part of the fight with Ali, like describe it and tell me why is it important on a global cultural level.
Wait, that's in your soccer class?
Well, I do sport. I do like sports history. I rarely do just soccer because I tried to get them to think comparatively. You could do that in soccer too. Sometimes I do soccer. Sometimes I do football in the global South. Sometimes I do sport and society. I play around with it. But those are the types of assignments that come to mind.
Yeah. Peter, you have them do a podcast, right?
This semester, I had them do a podcast. It was a group project. Podcasts are fun, but they're difficult to do well, and they do require careful scaffolding and management. So the larger the class becomes, the more laborious for everyone involved the assignment and assessment is. So, and also, university study is famous for being very lonely and individually based. And I do believe that every once in a while, some collective enterprise does us some good, even though there's always problems with some groups where, a couple of people disappear and one or two individuals are carrying more of the burden. But, that there's learning involved there. And as long as you ask them to submit their self-assessment, students tend to be pretty honest, even the lazy ones I found over the years. But the podcast, it has a technology component to it also. So the group project means that maybe somebody who's more adept with audio and editing might take the technology component of the labor burden, and then maybe somebody who's stronger in writing can take the script, sort of take leadership on that aspect. Maybe somebody else who's in journalism, is more comfortable editing, the script. There's all sorts of ways in which students contribute to that. But the podcast is either a scripted story based on a topic found in the syllabus and therefore the assigned readings. So I don't encourage them to do any additional research, though I'm not going to prevent them from doing that. Or they can do an oral history interview with a scholar who works on football or a practitioner. So a former player or a coach or a referee or an administrator, and talk about the role of soccer in their life. And it's 10 minutes, no longer. So I have a whole host of criteria. The audio quality is part of it. The edutainment factor is part of it. The script is part of it. So in that sense, like Brenda was saying, I treat it like any other assessment in a regular history class. And it's good for students to know that at the outset. So it's not something they can just switch on their voice recording on their phone and just BS their way through it. That's not going to produce very good results for anyone. But the important thing is start early in the semester, treat it like any other, major project. Make sure that you have them submit the topic, then, their preliminary list of sources. And then I even encourage them to submit a draft if they've recorded a few minutes or even a complete draft. And then I can give them some feedback. And some students, are organized and do that. And so ultimately the outcome in those cases is often quite good. But what's fun about the podcast is that some of them really get into it. And some of the students who are generally quiet in class suddenly blossom with a microphone in front of them. They understand that this is a different medium. It's not writing. It's, and doing history in a different medium is not easy. And so it's nice to be able to provide students with an opportunity to shine that maybe my more conventional assignments don't really allow them to do that as much. And the other thing is that they share them often. I mean, how many times have you heard of your students sharing a paper they wrote for you? I mean, be honest. They share them with the recycling bin. I mean, that's who they share it with, if they're ecologically smart. But these end up in emails to parents or, sometimes even on their blogs if they're on the more nerdy side. And so that's pretty cool that they have second lives and maybe even third lives for things that they did as schoolwork. So that's a nice thing. Other times I have them journaling. It requires a smaller class. I can't keep up with 50, 80 journals. But if it's in a more seminar type thing, I have them journal and sort of do the ethnographic observations that Brenda was talking about. Watch a video. We watched an incredible video with Pete Watson, who wrote this great book about football and nation making in post-conflict Colombia. And he showed us the video of the FARC guerrillas playing with former paramilitaries. And, journal on that. Like students don't know anything about the Colombian conflict, let alone the U.S. role in it. But, what was it like to see these men and women, playing against their former potential killers? Like, what did that effect have on you? How was this portrayed? What was the agenda of the filmmakers? To think of it not just as narrative, but also as a potential source. And so journaling is a great way to kind of put down your raw thoughts on paper. And that is part of what we do as scholars, not just the finished product that ends up in books and articles. So that's another type of assessment, along with the usual boring exams and papers.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of having students work collectively, I mean, it's always a hassle, right? Like, there's a moment where you're herding cats, but it can be really productive as long as it's intriguing to them. So a couple years ago, I had them create a digital finding aid for a given country. And what I pushed them to do was to find resources, articles, newspapers, film, even song lyrics for football in a country where we just don't have such a deep understanding of the sporting culture. So in one case, it was like, what does football look like in Haiti, right? What kind of resources can you assemble to inform someone, a non-specialist, about what football means in Haiti? Guatemala was another case. Nicaragua was a little bit different. Paraguay, right? Like, we know all about Uruguay and Brazil and Colombia, but Paraguay, how do we think of their football and cultures? And to their credit, they came up with some amazing listings of films, and then they would embed certain clips they'd find on YouTube. And by the end of it, these teams of four had kind of created almost like a bibliography that, you know, a professional scholar could use to like dig a little deeper. You know, football just allows for this kind of stuff to happen. When it comes to lyric analysis, I mean, a student who can read Portuguese, right, and can start to track, how people think about Flamengo or Corinthians, or like you can do lyric analysis through it, is phenomenal. I think the biggest challenge that we have is language, right? So much of football culture is not represented in English, right? So that's where maybe you assemble different teams of students. Oh, someone has French. Okay, you're going to join this team. Someone has Spanish. Okay, you're going to join this team. Senegalese students, well, you might need a Wolof speaker to access that particular archive. But there's certainly very creative ways to do it. And I think probably digital assignments are the way to go on some of these.
Wonderful. Good.
You asked Philip how the field has changed. Also, just to add, since Goldblatt's Doorstopper that came out in 2006,
mid 2000, both of those, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Franklin Foer actually preceded it by a couple of years. And of course, the most problematic chapter in that book is the Inter one, which I think, just created pure fiction out of an anecdote. But let's
you
set
do
that
like
aside.
Inter, yeah. I'm picking up on that, yeah.
And so the amount of work that's available now, scholarly work, is phenomenal. I mean, compared to 15 years ago, it's just remarkable. So if folks are contemplating doing this type of teaching, or just to integrate maybe a unit or two into a broader course, say maybe an area studies type course, that has a unit on soccer, I mean, there is a fabulous amount of stuff out there. And so dig in, read, become knowledgeable, because there is certainly something out there that folks can use. And then YouTube, of course, as was just mentioned by Pablo. I mean, you can find almost anything. I remember when David Goldblatt came to the Football Scholars Forum, we had during COVID, the first part of COVID, and we couldn't do anything. We couldn't watch football. We couldn't walk outside our home without fear of contracting COVID, etc. We had 5 or 6 sessions on his new book, his most recent book, The Age of Football, Football in the 21st Century. And so we did one continent in each section. And he said, I think it was in the opening session that we did, that this was the hardest book he wrote because of the amount of material that was available. And David is just a phenomenal mind. He's encyclopedic in his approach, but it's becoming almost impossible to do that now. I mean, you cannot compress everything that is out there. It's so highly specialized and good in many cases that you can't write the type of book that David wrote in 2006, The Ball is Round, anymore, and get away with it. It's certainly, you couldn't do it in a couple of years. I mean, if you had 30 years to write it, maybe you could, but it would be like, 29,000 pages. So, I mean, it's just a great time to teach, but it also requires a lot of preparation. So folks who think it's going to be easy, run the risk of putting themselves in a pretty tough spot and making some mistakes that should be avoided, probably.
I don't know how many professors there are in the listenership of this podcast. I know there's a couple. For those who are not, it always, academic literature tends to specialize slightly ahead of the curve before things arrive in actual popular discourse. And so some of those nuances do arrive in widespread popular soccer knowledge, and some of them don't. But I think what Peter said is certainly true, that the kind of, let me explain everything to you, dear American, about soccer, that kind of book, you can't really write that anymore. I mean, we're not even outside of academia at that place, I think, in North America.
I'm not
anymore.
sure they should have written it then.
What is that?
I'm not really convinced they should have written it then.
Okay.
David Goldblatt's a wonderful thinker and a friend and writer and activist, but he knows clearly how. I do think that there's an argument about it re-entrenching many of the problematic, the idea of the anecdote as history. A lot of people who don't speak Spanish, like Jonathan Wilson's Angels with Dirty Faces, is deeply offensive to me as someone who has spent my life trying to read and understand a culture outside my own. To go ahead and just, write it because it's popular and you heard it from some people that shouldn't be assigned in a history class. And I'm glad people like it. I mean, good for you, you're reading. But keep in mind that that's, despite what the press will tell you, that is not what a historian would say is up to snuff. I'm sorry, it's just not. Galeano included.
Yeah.
It happens in Spanish as well. Eduardo Galeano reimagined the continent of Latin America without a woman existing. And that's just not okay. And it just re-entrenched. I understand he's an essayist or whatever, but people are in the popular world will interpret that as history because that's the history they're getting. And I'm really glad they're reading. But sometimes I'm not sure if you read that and it re-entrenches old ideas that we've been really struggling to do research to reveal are not true, if that's worthy. Sorry.
No.
Like, not to be a downer on any of it.
No, it's very honest.
I think there's a big caution label that we need to have on some of this stuff. I can't tell you how many times people tell me about Eduardo Galeano. And frankly, as long as you teach it as fiction, that's fine. But you won't find, but it performs Soccer in Shadow and Sun, under Shadow and Sun. It performs as truth. And so when you read it, you read that the Chileans really lodged this complaint in 1916, for example, against, what does he say? I think he says it's the Uruguayans for playing with Africans, and then something, and that's just not true. There's no source for that. There's no source that exists. I've spent 20 years and talked to 20 people. So anyway, it's not to get too specialist, but to say there's a reason to have that specialist literature. Yeah. And it's because some of the books that were too broad really re-entrenched some dangerous thinking, I think.
It's actually a very nice bridge you're building for me here, because I was wondering that if listeners who are not in academia, who are maybe not acquainted with some of the nuances we're talking about here, would be curious now and say, this is a topic I'm interested in enough. What is cutting edge literature on the game that I love? Where would we point them? First, perhaps to Peter's Football Scholars Forum and the website, perhaps, but whether other resources, landing places, and recommendations you would have for listeners who, well, are not professors?
That's a really good question. I feel like we should have like a tweet about that where we think about that for a minute for me, because I don't, it's difficult in English, right?
Right. No, we can happily follow it up with a tweet and with show notes as well. There's always that for podcast episodes. So look into show notes for some tips as well.
What comes to my mind is like Roger Kittleson on Brazil, Peter, obviously, Laurent Dubois still, but there's newer stuff. Todd Cleveland's got some stuff out there that's great. I'm just telling you because you can search on Amazon probably. There's a new translation at University of North Carolina Press of Mario Filho's book, which is worth looking at. So I'm just thinking there's a lot of stuff. It might be a fun Twitter thread or something.
Okay. Yeah, very, very good. Be up for that. Peter, Football Scholars, oneword.org. Yes, we do want to point people there, right?
Sure, why not?
Absolutely.
We even have an archive on the site that's freely accessible that includes most of our sessions, the audio only. So have fun listening to our conversations. It's kind of like an intellectual pickup game, or as they would say in South America, pelada. So, we don't get lost in jargon and highly theoretical discussions most of the time. It's a conversation with the author or authors. So we've been going for 13 years. So there's a lot of books on there. Most of them are scholarly works, but we do occasionally break our vows and welcome non-scholars. So there are some conversations with journalists and other authors. We even had a really fun one with Ray Hudson many, 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 many years ago. This must have been, I don't know, maybe 10, 11 years ago. Cool. We discussed the film on the North American Soccer League on the Cosmos with him. Yep. And of course, Ray Hudson played in the NASL, played against Pelé. He was in his, mid-20s with Tampa Bay. No, Fort Lauderdale, sorry, I think. And we got Ray Hudson. And Ray Hudson, the first thing he said when he joined the conversation was, "Great to be here. I think this is a football think tank." And so in his inimitable style, in just, 10 seconds, he coined a phrase that has kind of stuck.
I think you're using it now, aren't you? Officially, it becomes part of your slogan, a little bit, right? Yeah.
Of course. So that's a good place. There's a list of films also that is badly needed of an update, but this is all a labor of love. So if somebody wants to work on that, please. This is a collective. I just happen to host it, Yeah, and I would say also the Society for American Soccer History that goes by the acronym SASH. That is a formal organization of U.S. soccer historians, and they have a lot of resources on their website. So just do a search for Society of American Soccer Historians.
Yes, I'll have that linked as well.
They do have also sessions with authors on a fairly regular basis. And there might be other similar ones. There's the Football Collective also in the UK. That is a group of scholars, many of them from across the disciplines. I don't know what their web presence is like. I know they have a social media presence, but I don't know if it's the type of space where you can go and get recommendations for books. But yeah, there's a few places out there that you can navigate and, just as you said, read. But I think what also Brenda just pointed to, be wary of some of the stuff that's out there. And, there's a long running kind of debate, sometimes an acrimonious one between academics and journalists. I've learned a lot from journalists. The best ones are very good storytellers. Very few are better than David Goldblatt at telling a story. They could play loose with the truth. But that's where we come in. And so, just be aware that what you're getting from a journalist is different from what you would be getting from an academic. And it's good to be well read. So imbibe in both and keep a healthy skepticism, with you all the time.
Very good. I think that's a good concluding word to listeners of the podcast. And, well, to me as well, as an interloper who's never taught or written academically about this game that I grew up with and shapes so much of how I view the world, nevertheless. All the classes sound interesting. I'm sure you have listeners now that are trying to explore options. How can I pay just for that one class to sit in? Thank you for sharing all of that with us. It was fun to take a little detour to what kind of treatment soccer gets in American universities and American academic lives. Hear from you and hear of the long legacy you've left already through your writings and through your teaching for the game and for those who love it and for a critical engagement of that game in North America as well. Thank you all so much. Any final words? Anything that I'm sure there's plenty of stuff that I should have asked and didn't, but any final words that we need to get in at this point that can't wait for future conversations?
No, I'm good.
We're good. All right.
And Pablo, also good to see you, Brenda.
Very good to see you all. I hope you have a great day. Thank you. Bye, friends.
Thank you all. Be well, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Peter. Ciao.
Thank you, Pablo. Ciao.
Be well.
Well, I promised it wasn't going to be boring, and I trust it wasn't. On to the next episode already on next Monday the 12th. So back to regular rhythm again with the portrait of Clapton Community Football Club in East London. The next episode after that should be a portrait also recorded live from a little steelworkers town in the middle of, well, not quite nowhere, but close to it, in the middle of Sweden, that somewhat inexplicably has survived in the top tiers of Swedish football, and where football has an outsized role to the vibe, the culture, the politics of the place, and also the way it deals with migration and the downsizing of the steel industry there. The town is Degerfors, Degerfors, and the club is Degerfors IF, and I got to talk to the club's president there, as well as two nice retirees who run Sweden's only football museum there. Last but not least, won't ask you to give stars, though I do appreciate them. I'll just state the obvious. It's a pretty niche product here, well off the usual English-speaking soccer coverage, and you could help its visibility greatly by finding a way to share what you've listened to here with your friends and with those who are also interested in some soccer journeys off the beaten path. Look forward to Monday the 12th, the next episode, and to your feedback as well on Twitter, the Assistant Professor of Football, as well as on Facebook. Be well.